I'm Matthew Barzun, the new United States Ambassador to the United Kingdom. Here's Sir Winston Churchill, cigar in hand, looking intently and purposefully over my shoulder every day. And I love it because it's a reminder of the man who coined the term special relationship back in 1946. We have to talk and we have to act, and that's what we're doing, acting against the atrocities you've just seen that ISIL's committing with 65 other countries, including the UK. The UK makes every organization it's a part of stronger. We know that from ones where we sit literally next to each other because of an accident of alphabet, United States, United Kingdom, but we stand next to each other not by accident because we share these same values.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Armini. I'm the Senior Vice President for External Affairs here at Northeastern. By the way, it was really fitting that we had a British band playing when we were coming in. That was The Who. So my job is just to welcome everyone. We have another packed house tonight at East Village. And I also want to bring greetings from President Aoun, who's not able to be here. He, as you know, if you come to these events, loves to be the penetrating questioner. But he's traveling on university business. So today we have someone sitting in for the president, a young man, Mohammed Al-Wazan, who is a double Husky, 2 Northeastern degrees. In fact, just graduated from the law school a few months ago. So Mo is going to step in on that role. Before we get to that part, the ambassador is going to come up and talk for 15 minutes or so and show a few slides. So I'm not going to bother to read the bio that you all have in front of you. I'll just say a couple things. This position of ambassador to the UK, which is, I believe, technically the U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James, it is the premier diplomatic post in the U.S. government. And Ambassador Barzun follows in the footsteps of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, a couple of others. But the point is, 5 of them went on to go from this position as ambassador to be president of the United States. So not that we're elevating expectations too much, but we may ask him what he's doing next. So, and the last thing I'll say, by the way, since we're at a university and this is an academic institution, the ambassador is here with his son Jacques, who I'm going to assume is named after the legendary Columbia University professor who really pioneered the field of cultural history. So it's an honor to have Jacques here as well. So everyone, please give a great Northeastern welcome to Ambassador Matthew Barzun.
Hi. Good evening. That was so cool, that video, and thank you, Mike, for inviting me, and Mohammed, thanks in advance for our discussion up here, and thank you all for coming. I've never seen that video clip, so you all must have produced that. And whenever I get wonderful introductions like I just did, I'm always tempted to say, oh, I wish my mom and dad were here. And actually tonight, my father is here. So hi, Dad. And my brother and my stepmother. And it was tempting. And by the way, all those presidents who had my job before all served as president before 1870. Just saying. But it was tempting coming back here to Boston. I grew up in Lincoln, Massachusetts, not too far from here. And by the way, those of you who think dorms like this are normal, I'm here to tell you this is not normal, it is extraordinary. And in fact, all of the building, I got to look out, what Northeastern has become since I was a college student is remarkable, and I just applaud the president and his whole team for what they are building. But it was tempting, coming back here to my hometown of Boston in my current role to talk about, you know, where all of this began, the awkward bits, 1776 and all that. And then right after that awkward bit, the first guy they sent, as you mentioned, was John Adams, a good Bostonian, going over to do the job I try to do. Or to talk all about the great future and all the innovation happening here at Northeastern and what that means for the special relationship going forward. And those are all tempting topics, but I don't want to talk about those, as important as they are. Because I don't know if you're feeling what I am feeling, but there seems to be something going on, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. And we have people questioning the motives and the actions of leaders of institutions, both private and public. We have people questioning on both sides of the Atlantic and on both sides of the political aisle these international systems that we've actually built up, the US and the UK, since Sir Winston Churchill and FDR worked so closely together 7 decades ago, questioning, are these things even worthwhile? And so it gives me a great sense of unease. And people seem to be talking at each other, and they seem to be talking past each other, and there seems to be a gulf that's growing. And so I've been thinking a lot about this as I think about 3.5 months left in this job where I will have served for 3.5 years. And I wanted to share with you, before opening it up, my thoughts on where might this have come from and how might each of us do something about it. And where did this come from, this growing gulf and people talking at each other and past each other? And one of the great parts of this job is at Embassy London, we get a huge influx of official visitors coming through our embassy from the United States. And we just completed our fiscal year and on September 30th, and we just looked back and we had 24,000 official visit nights. Right, so if an Army general and her 4 staff come, that's 5 people for 3 nights, that's 15 nights. So we have lots of visitors. And I got to meet this one guy. He's a law enforcement professional. And I was quickly reading my memo before I had my meeting with him. And I looked over his resume, and the job he had right before the current one was he was sent by our Justice Department into communities in the United States where the trust between the men and women in law enforcement had so tragically broken down. You can think Ferguson, Missouri, but obviously there have been many others that we've all read about. So he was sent into these places to try to go change the culture of how the police and the communities they're sworn to protect and serve worked. And he told me this story, and I said, well, I was really curious about it, because as I'll share with you later, it's a topic I hear a lot about as I engage with British young people. And I said, well, what do you do when you go to one of these communities? And so he told me, he said, well, the first thing I do is 2 things. I gather a group from the community, so not law enforcement, but men and women from all different walks of life in one room. So picture our group here tonight. And he just puts one word up on the PowerPoint slide, and he asks them to write down the first word that comes to their mind. We're not going to really play the game, but imagine you're playing. And the word is housekeeper. Got it? Housekeeper. So everyone writes down their word, and then he asks them what they wrote down. And if you have 100 people, you probably get 100 different answers. Some people say mom, because their mother worked as a housekeeper to put them through college. Or they write promotion because they want to get a promotion so they can afford to hire a housekeeper once a month. Or some, if they might write Downton Abbey, or they might write hard work. I mean, lots of different answers. So he takes all of those down and records them, puts them in his pocket. Then he does the second thing, which is he goes, meets with his fellow law enforcement, the policemen and women in that community. Same game. And he told me, you put up the word housekeeper, and the law enforcement professionals nearly all write the same word. Thief. Thief. And I thought, wow, weird. And so I was like, what do you mean? He goes, yeah, well, think about it. These are very smart, curious, courageous men and women. But most of them were raised in families that didn't have a housekeeper, and most of them don't make enough money to hire a housekeeper. Therefore, the only housekeepers they ever meet are on the job. People who are either accused of or guilty of stealing something. Right? And the lingo in the community, we're hearing about it more these days, is implicit bias. But I heard that story and I thought about my work as a diplomat. And those of us, whether we're in government or we're in academia or we're in business and we're committed to sort of international cooperation, things like that. And I thought first, what are the words that I say that I think are benign or helpful, like housekeeper, that other people might not hear that way? Words like, or phrases like, intellectual property protection, or international rules-based order, or free trade and investment deals. I mean, I say those things all the time. And clearly, people in this country, large numbers of them, and large numbers of people in the country I serve in the United Kingdom, when we say those things, they hear them as thief. And then the flip side of that, what are the words that we, whoever we is, where people are using words to communicate with us, and yet they're hitting our hot buttons. They just mean them like housekeeper, benign and descriptive, but we start to fold our arms and clench our fists and point our fingers because they're hitting hot buttons with us. So maybe that's a little bit of where this came from, and then how might we do something about this? And as I've reflected on that, what I think is an incredibly important piece of how we can help is actually a bit of advice President Obama gave me right before I became ambassador for the first time. Before the UK, I was in Sweden. And before that, I had been working on the internet business. And I had just worked on President Obama's campaign. It's 2009. He's just been sworn in as the 44th president. And I get to meet him in the Oval Office before heading off to Sweden. So I put on my coat and tie. We didn't dress like that in the internet days. We wore jeans and hoodies. But I dressed up, went into the Oval Office. And we knew each other from the campaign. But I hadn't seen him when he was president. I was a little nervous. Hi, Mr. President. We chit-chatted. We sat down in chairs kind of like this. And I really only had one question, so I just asked it. Mr. President, what advice would you have for a first-time diplomat? And I remember he looked up for a while, and he thought, and he said, well, Matthew, listen. And I thought to myself, yes, Mr. President, that's why I've come all the way from Kentucky to be here. I was planning on listening. And in fact, I had my pen out and my little black book, and I was ready to write down all his pearls of wisdom. And that's all he said. And you guys are significantly quicker than I was, because it was a long and awkward pause as I sat there. And then, of course, it dawned on me slowly that his advice wasn't listen to all my great advice. His advice was simply listen. Listen. And so I tried to do that in Sweden. I'm trying to do that in the United Kingdom. And one group in particular that I wanted to listen to was 18-year-olds. We would call them, as Americans, high school seniors. People at this really exciting stage of their life deciding what they're going to go do next. So I have gone to 156 high schools all around the United Kingdom and engaged with and done a workshop with over 19,000 18-year-olds in Britain. And I do this little exercise. It's not a lecture. I give them a blank piece of paper and a pencil from the embassy, and I say, please draw me a picture of something that frustrates, concerns, or confuses you about the United States and what we're up to. And I want to show you, we made a word cloud, and I gave this to President Obama every time I see him, including recently. Now, if you go to a university like this, and you ask university students, the people who tend to come to things when the American ambassador to the UK shows up in London or in Newcastle or wherever, you will get sort of classic foreign policy issues. You will get Guantanamo Bay, surveillance, Israel, Palestine, war, oil, that kind of thing. And with these younger folks, those things show up too. But not nearly as much as these things in red. And it's hard to see some of these small words, but all the things in blue are what we would all think of here as foreign policy, and the things in red are things we would think of as domestic policy. So that's what they want to talk about, and so we do. And this is complicated. I mean, police misconduct is how we talk about it. Police brutality is how they refer to it. Guns, racism, healthcare, all these things. And so we can divide them, and I can divide them into red and blue, but the fact is it's just purple to them. Domestic policy is foreign policy, is one of the things I learned from this. So that's most of the discussion. And then I asked them to flip over the piece of paper and draw a picture or write a word of something that inspires them or they like or gives them hope about the United States and what we're up to. The happy bit, as I call it. That's what we learn here. And I was sort of expecting to think things like freedom, an American dream. That's always nice for Americans to hear. Patriotism sometimes we get as a criticism, and it actually does show up on the other side as a small word, but much bigger here. Food. Who knew? NASA. So and we spent very little time on this because I think it's more important to talk about the difficult things. And I have been reflecting on sort of what I learned from listening and then what I learned about listening. And I was asked when the New York Times, and they showed a clip in that thing, wrote a nice story when I'd gone to my 100th school. And so someone from the British government asked me to come and present on International Day to a whole group of diplomats and government officials in the UK. And so I presented a much longer version of this with data and all this other stuff. And there was a guy, a diplomat, British diplomat, sitting in the front row of the presentation. And he was too polite to actually put two thumbs down. But that is exactly what he was feeling. I mean, you could just see it on his face, and he was just hating all of this. And I thought it was kind of neat. He did not. So it came time to open it up. And so he raised his hand. So I thought, okay, I want to hear what's on this guy's mind. So I asked him, and he basically said, well, Matthew, I don't see what all those pretty pictures have to do with policy. I mean, come on, listening, fine. Everyone listens. It's like motherhood and apple pie. And I'm not one of those people who's really good right at the moment of coming back with the quick reply. I wish I were, but I didn't. And I actually gave a very lame answer. I remember my voice went up a few levels. And I said, oh, no, this isn't policy, sir. This is engagement. Policy is, I do policy, I said defensively. I mean, come on, we're talking about imposing sanctions on Russia for what they're doing in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and look what we're doing to combat Ebola, and this is back then, and look what we're doing to counter ISIS and ISIL, and look what we're doing to try to get a political solution to the tragedy in Syria, and I started the laundry list, all the sort of policy things I worked on. And it's bugged me ever since, because I think he asked exactly the right question, and I think I gave precisely the wrong answer. And actually, the answer I wish I'd given, the seeds of, I think, the right answer are actually in his question, motherhood and apple pie. Now, motherhood, I mean, I think sort of skipping over motherhood is not a wise thing to do. I mean, none of us would be here without mothers. But it's the apple pie part. My little brother got married recently, and his best friend stood up and gave a great and short toast. And he told the story of when I think they had just gotten out of university and they had a place of their own, and they were going to go cook dinner for some young women they were friends with to try to impress them. Now, my brother wasn't a very good cook at the time, but his friend was a little bit of a better one and said, we're going to cook apple pie. And my brother Charles looked very skeptical, like, oof. And his friend assured him, no, Charles, it's going to be okay. It's simple. Okay, said Charles. So they start peeling, chopping and peeling and chopping and peeling. And the clock keeps going around, and all of a sudden the guests are going to show up, and they don't seem any closer to getting this pie done. And my brother turns to his best friend Jay, frustrated, and said, Jay, you told me this would be easy. And Jay didn't miss a beat, and he shot back. He said, no, I didn't. I said it would be simple. And it is. It is simple and hard and time-consuming and repetitive and meaningful. And Jay added later, just like marriage. And I would add, just like motherhood, just like fatherhood, just like listening, and just like diplomacy. And so the answer I wish I'd given that day to that gentleman was, sir, listening is policy. Listening is policy. And I've seen it happen, and it works. If you listen, people hear you differently. And I've seen it in a political context where Barack Hussein Obama in 2007 was in cornfields in Iowa with 12 people, kept doing that, and then he ends up, as our 44th president, getting sworn in with 2 million people on the mall. If you contrast those two images of Obama in a cornfield and then at the mall, some people think, oh, well, the common thing is this amazing speaker in the cornfield, this amazing speaker on the mall, and that is absolutely true. I don't think that's the interesting part of that contrast. He wasn't giving an amazing oratory in an Iowa cornfield. He was listening to their concerns, and he was asking what the government could do to try to help and asking them to help him. And then you see what he's done as president, taking that same spirit of listening and engagement to beginning to normalize relations with Cuba, trying to get 196 countries, including the number 1 and number 2 polluters, the US and China, to get together for a climate deal in Paris. And then importantly, to address the #1 security threat he identified when he took office back in 2009, which was Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. Lots of back channel first, and then official negotiations, all done through really important listening, which is hard. You know what I think is not hard? What's actually kind of easy is building walls. And my wife and children, Jacques' little brother, and sister all moved back to Kentucky recently, and so we packed up all their stuff from London, including my youngest son's Lego collection. And as I dumped a whole drawer full of Lego into a packing box, it occurred to me, you know, if we were to give each of you a stack of Lego and give you 30 seconds today, we're going to come back, either build a wall or build a bridge. Go. Like, I think most of us would just build a wall. I mean, you just stand in one place and start stacking. And I think building bridges, it's easy for diplomats like me to say, it's actually hard to do. And I think it requires 3 things. First, you have to see yourself, and you have to know where you stand and what you stand for. That's hard. Then you have to see the other, not just tolerate the other and not just acknowledge the other, but really see the other. That's hard too. And then the third thing, which is you have to see yourself in the other. You have to explore the other shore. And I would argue that building bridges is as simple and as hard as that. And with that, I would love to take President Obama's advice and practice it right here by listening first to what Mohammed has to ask, and then later, as we open it up, to your suggestions, your thoughts, what you're thinking, and what you're feeling. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Mr. Ambassador, I would like to tell you how thrilled I am.
Please call me Matthew.
I will for this evening. Matthew, it's such an honor and a thrill to share the floor here with you. And I think in the spirit of listening, we definitely have a full house in front of us, and we would like to engage the crowd as much as we can, but definitely try to kickstart this conversation by asking you this. I've met ambassadors in general with my father, with my family, traveling, and the image we get when we meet an ambassador is a very traditional image. And the 21st century is a different one, and it imposes a change on traditional diplomacy. You are very popular on Twitter. I follow you. And my question...
Thank you.
My question to you is, how does the digital age today, with the social media outlets and the plethora of news outlets and the rise in technologies, affect the way you conduct your job as an ambassador? Is it an impediment or is it a compliment?
And I used to, as you know, work in the internet business before doing my diplomacy at a company called CNET. I was very reluctant. I think technology is fundamental. I mean, I think sort of generally, as I'm sure many people here, I think it's generally a really good, empowering set of tools that mostly make the world a much better place. I think in the hands of diplomats or politicians, however, it easily can, it's neutral. And so if you love to talk at people, wow, what a great tool Twitter is. You can talk at them all the time in little tiny nuggets.
Right.
If you like to listen to people, it also can provide you a tool to listen more effectively. But I think what you do in sort of analog life, because I remember I did those, I went to 3 high schools, as I mentioned, and by the 4th one, a wonderful person on my team's like, aren't you done? I was like, oh no, I'm not stopping. And you know, this was sort of at the 2-month mark. They're like, oh dear. I was like, no, I'm going to do this as long as I'm here. And it's like, but it's always sort of the same. And in some sense, yeah, I mean, they generally, you saw those words don't change that much time to time, but those are 200 different kids or 100 different young people every time. And so I think too often we can think of technology as a shortcut to avoid the sort of simple hard work of actually listening, and you can just push stuff out.
Right, right. And I think, kind of in the spirit of that, in the spirit of building bridges and technology, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about how can you really leverage technology or innovation in general as the United States to build bridges with other nations? How possible and plausible is that?
Well, I think something that First Lady Michelle Obama is doing. When I fly back to London that morning, she is connecting, I think, 96 different countries for her Let Girls Learn initiative. And she came and did it in London with a wonderful school called Mulberry School for Girls, which is a majority, it's an all-girls schools, majority Muslim, Bangladeshi Brit community. And she challenged these girls to not only, and they're really achieving great things in London, and that's wonderful, but she reminded them, like, hey, you've got a responsibility not just to take care of yourself and your community in London, but to reach back to the places you came from and to make sure other girls who aren't as fortunate as you are feeling connected.
Right.
So I think things like that, and it's hard to go to, so they're all dialing in. I forget which company is facilitating it, but one of the big ones you've all heard of is facilitating 96 countries coming together.
Sure. Well, I want to shift the conversation kind of more towards foreign policy, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Last time we met in London, you gave a talk 1 week before the Brexit happened.
I remember. Yeah.
And we were talking about concerns and we were talking about opportunities, advantages, disadvantages. Now that it has happened, can you elaborate a little bit on how did the Brexit impact the US-UK relationship?
Well, and I don't know how much you all were following all this, but we meaning the US government, President Obama, John Kerry, other government officials, myself included, before the referendum, and we always sort of asked ourselves, like, hey, this is a domestic thing. Should we say something? They had a Scotland referendum, and we did end up engaging on that. And we always prefaced everything we said with, of course it's up to you, but hey, if you ask us, which everyone did, here's what we think. And then we'd always say, again, just to be careful, and of course it's up to you. And so we did that again with Brexit, and we did it in a spirit of friendship. Right. And we thought that the UK, and we said so, we value a strong UK in a strong EU. That was our position up till June 23rd. And we said at the time, and if, regardless of how the British people voted, the special relationship will be strong after. There's so much we're going to do together, and I think that is true. And I think if you think about our new formulation, really only changes one word. I don't want to sound glib. I mean, lots of things are going to change. But now we want a strong UK and a strong EU. So for my job, I've always been focused on strong US-UK, and so there's so much we did, and I laundry listed some of them quickly, that we do with the UK that don't change: counter-ISIL strategy, diplomatic engagement, NATO, UN Security Council, what we did together on Ebola. All those things won't be impacted directly by their decision to withdraw from the European Union.
What will be impacted?
Well, they'll have to figure out their new trading and other relationship with Europe. One thing that we really benefited from, I think the world did, was I mentioned Russia, Ukraine. The UK was a very effective voice within the European Union to get all 27 other countries to impose sanctions on Russia for trying to redraw the boundaries of Europe at the barrel of a gun. Let's not forget that. And we didn't want to use military tools for obvious reasons about that, but we didn't want to do nothing, so we used sanctions to try to impose real costs and consequences. So we did it as the United States. What we've learned is unilateral sanctions are fine. We do those occasionally. If you can get a lot more people involved, they're a lot more effective.
Right.
Back to the Iran deal, it was incredible sanctions that actually brought the government of Iran to the negotiating table. And so the UK, as a really big economy itself, is important, but their role within the UK, getting those other countries to do it, not only put them in place, but they have to roll them over every 6 months.
Right.
So that's something, when they're not there, that will make that, that's a loss.
And I think what also highlights the relationship from what I understand is that The UK is the single largest foreign country that is a foreign direct investor into the United States, and vice versa. Correct?
Yeah. So we have one way to think about it. I love it. So 1 million Americans wake up every day here and go to work for British companies, and 1 million Brits wake up every day and go to work for American companies. And that didn't happen yesterday, and it didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen because 2 government officials sat in a room and decided it should be so. It is decades and decades of this simple hard work of listening to customers and listening to clients and listening to counterparts and colleagues and all that stuff over decades. And that is so strong. Mm-hmm. And those commercial and emotional bonds between our 2 countries, they were really strong before June 23rd, and they're really strong on June 24th, and we just got to keep promoting that.
Sure, sure. I think we'd like to just take a minute and listen to the crowd. We have a couple of social media questions that are posted on Facebook.
Oh, great.
So we can take one question from that. Aubrey, if you can go ahead.
The first question is, can you talk about some of the differences in being an ambassador to Sweden versus the UK?
Oh, so I love them both. Sweden was the first place I served, and it was amazing. And it was, I tried to learn a little bit of Swedish, but I've actually learned that speaking English is not like speaking American English. So it's more, and one of the hardest things, I mean, many of you have probably lived overseas or even lived in the UK. The hardest thing on the UK part was British understatement. And I grew up watching British comedy on TV, so I knew about understatement. But it's actually hard as an American because I think we naturally kind of, ratchet things up. And I remember there was a guy who had worked at our embassy for like 47 years, this amazing guy, and I was at his retirement going away thing. So I give him a toast, and I had got some notes about all the things he'd accomplished. And he's standing sort of right where you are, and I'm saying these nice things to him, and I keep adding these adjectives, like it's awesome and it's whatever. And with every adjective I added in praise, he was diminishing what I said in equal measure. And that's just a strange thing as an American to try to adjust to. And I mentioned this to a British friend who said, did it ever occur to you Americans that it might be American overstatement and not British understatement? To which I responded, no, heck no, of course not.
I know that you ate lamb and potatoes for a very long time in the UK. Was that true?
Yeah, I will never live this down. Actually, this is maybe a practical and tactical bit of advice. And I had been warned, if you've ever done media training, the good ones always tell you, they say beware of that last interview question, like you're taking off your microphone and you're leaving. And the good interviewers will ask you that one last question. You think you've gotten through it. And it's a very similar thing. And this good journalist said, one thing you would change about, one thing you love about the UK. Well, that's easy, so I said that. One thing you don't like. I'm like, come on, I'm a diplomat. I'm not falling for that one. And then as I'm leaving, she's like, one thing you would change. And then I just fell into it, undiplomatic, and criticized their national dish. And I mean, it was a small interview in a small publication, but boy, did that thing travel around. It is now on my Wikipedia page, so it will be with me as long, far after I have left the planet.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, speaking of Wikipedia, you talk a little bit about news sources and news credibility. A lot of professors here do not like Wikipedia because it's not, we can't even cite it as students. I don't know what you have to say about that.
I have lots to say about that.
I know. But in terms of, in an age where you can get your news from everywhere and you can get your sources from everywhere, how careful should one be in limiting that?
Yeah, I have to, so Wikipedia, how many people here have used Wikipedia in the last month? How many people have found a mistake in it? How many people use it anyway? Yeah, and by the way, so it was started by a kid from Alabama, young guy from Alabama, Jimmy Wales, who lives a few blocks from me in London, and he's become a good pal. And what's amazing about Wikipedia is when he started it, he was competing against one of the oldest companies in the world, Encyclopedia Britannica, and at the time, richest company by market capitalization in the entire world, Microsoft. who had started, do you remember what theirs was called? Yes. Those of us of a certain age remember. It was called Encarta. So they were duking it out, right? How many people have used Encarta in the last month? Yeah, nobody. So it didn't work, but they had the richest company in the world with sort of unlimited budget and unlimited clever engineers set out to beat the oldest company in the world. And they were duking it out, and along comes a kid from Alabama, and his idea is, I'm going to beat both of them, and I'm not going to pay anyone anything. Who's with me? And no one was with him. Nobody, except for his small core team. But the interesting bit that Jimmy told me, and he talks about this publicly, is he didn't call it Wikipedia. It was called in the 90s Newpedia, N-U-P-E-D, Newpedia, and it was almost the same with one important difference. He's like, I'm the new kid on the block. I don't pay anyone anything. I have to be doubly paranoid. I'm going to have every article double peer reviewed before it gets published. And at the end of the first year, he had 18 articles published. Jimmy is good at math, and he's like, well, I'm never going to win at 18 articles a year. So a young guy on his team comes up to him and says, there's this thing called Wiki. You should try it. And he's like, what do you mean? He's like, well, someone could write a sentence, and then someone else could edit it, and you could just write a paragraph, and it would grow over time. He's like, fine. Let's try it. And it is the largest human knowledge transfer engine in the history of the world. And yes, it has mistakes, but guess what? So does Britannica, and so did Encarta. But you think they're going to go republish the entire bookshelf of Britannica because they found a mistake? No.
Doesn't make sense. Yeah. Well, let's take a couple of questions from the crowd. We have two runners on each side. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll take one right there. Please introduce yourself and then just ask your question, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Manan Desai. I'm pursuing Masters in Energy Systems at Northeastern College. So you spoke about listening to 18-year-olds. Tonight there is a group of 18 to 20-year-olds. They are camping outside the university, and they are campaigning for a fossil-free Northeastern University. They are sitting over there for days without food and without any in the cold. They are just camping outside. So my question to you is, when will world leaders, diplomats, and people when will they truly move beyond rhetoric, public speeches, conferences, and summits, and take any concrete and provide concrete solutions to make this world fossil fuel free? Thank you.
Thank you. I got lost all around here. I did not see them on my meanderings back and forth across Huntington Avenue. I applaud them using their democratic right to peaceful protest. I think that's fantastic. And I think I am very proud of what my boss and our president has done in his nearly 8 years in office. And he did all of the above energy strategy, which made some in his own party who are determined, as maybe you are or they are, to have no fossil fuels part of a transition. He would respectfully disagree and say, look, burning natural gas is better than coal. Let's do it in the transition on our way to get there. But I think the way we make change in our country is by people being farther out there than others and pushing and pushing. And you saw that on LGBT rights. You see it on energy. You see it on efforts to deal with gun violence and to deal with police misconduct. I think that's what we've signed up for in this democracy, and I think it's really good. And I think it's a challenge for people in positions of power to listen to those groups. I also think it's incumbent upon them to listen, and when they win a seat at the table, so to speak, because of their demonstrations, that they shift gears, which is really important, to then get something done that's on their path to what they want, and not fall into that trap of sort of maximalism where it's perfection or nothing. Because I think if you see that in other parts of our democracy, that's not how we move forward, I don't think.
Yep. I think we also have another question in the back over there. Please.
Hello, my name is Macarena Flores, and I'm a senior in History and International Affairs. As you mentioned bridge building and how that's such a key part of your duties as a diplomat, but lately it appears to me as an international student and as someone who pays attention to the news that a lot of the discourse in domestic American and British politics is about burning bridges down. There's racist discourse that's being legitimized, and with the increasing anxiety as the election is upon us, how do you think relations will change in the potential reality of a Trump presidency?
Well, I can address the first part of your question. I really can't. There's an important tradition in our diplomatic system. I mean, my politics aren't that hard to guess based on who I used to work for and who appointed me. But in my job, which this is part of, it is not. So I'm not a Democrat ambassador, a Republican ambassador. So I have to stay out of party politics back here at home. And to a certain extent, in the United Kingdom, their domestic politics as well. But look, I think at the first part of your question, the unease you're feeling is exactly the unease I'm feeling, and why I think I wanted to spend our time tonight encouraging and talking about and thinking about building bridges and not burning them down. Because I think that's the hard work of each of us. In your work in international relations, mine in diplomacy for now, whatever I go do next. And again, it's easy to say, it's hard to do, so I think we need to talk about how to do it more.
Let us take another question from the social media, and then you will go next after.
Secretary of State John Kerry was our commencement speaker this past year. Can you talk about your history of working with him and what he was like as a boss?
Sure, I listened to that speech. It was at the Garden, wasn't it? Yeah, it was amazing. And I loved what he talked about. And I think he ended it by saying, oh dear, and now I should remember what he said. Maybe you can help me. But he really talked about how pessimism and apathy are the real dangers to our democracy, which I think is a really good point and touches on the woman's question in the back as well. So he is a distant cousin of mine. So I went in 1982 when I was 12 years old to his lieutenant governor debate in some windowless, soulless, multi-purpose room at some school somewhere in Massachusetts. And I remember seeing him there. And then I interned for him back in 1989 when he was a freshman senator. And when Milli Vanilli topped the charts, that's a joke for old people, like me. And I was explaining to him when I got this job, I was explaining to a British colleague how I was related, and I was sort of mapping it out on a napkin. And he leans back and he says, yeah, yes. We have those in Britain too. They're called strangers. Which was kind of a good, because he's a very, very distant cousin, but I really enjoy working for him. And by the way, he's come 30 times to London in my 3 years. And on one of the first trips, I went out to the airport to meet him, and we're driving back together in the back of the car and catching up. And then he got a call from the Russian foreign minister. And he sort of sweetly said, is it okay if I take this? So like, I mean, it was sort of a rhetorical question. I mean, I wasn't going to say no. I don't think he'd think I was going to say no, but it was nice. So I said, oh, yeah, by all means. And then I thought to myself, this is going to be fascinating. You know, I get to hear half a conversation at this critical time. And those two talk, you know, almost daily. It's a very rough patch right now based on what's going on in Syria, but they've always stayed engaged throughout. And so at the end of the trip, I thought, I thought I'd hear half the conversation. And I heard maybe 20%. In that, Secretary Kerry started off the conversation asking a really difficult but open-ended question, and then listening, and then playing back the words he'd just heard. Did I hear that correctly? Are you really saying this? Clarifying, and then listening. And I thought that was a wonderful moment of listening in action. So that's one of the things that I've been inspired by.
So let us listen to the next question. Please go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here this evening. And my question is, it's kind of a broad question. So when we think about 21st century, we think globalization. Everyone is interconnected. doesn't matter where in the world you are, you can just get the news in a split second. But at the same time, 21st century brought a fear of politics, division, as we mentioned earlier, building walls, and isolation. Why do you think is that? In a way, we want to be connected, but at the same time, we want to become isolated, divided, and not create bridges anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, statistically speaking, President Obama loves to remind people of this, and you all know it too. It's like if you were to pick any time to be born, and you couldn't control where you were born or to whom you were born, you would pick now, right? In the sense of you are more likely to survive out of infancy, more likely to lead something like a full life in something like freedom or full freedom. Right, so that's just true, and all the data backs that up. And yet, to your point, it's like we don't live statistically, so it's actually not much of a comfort at all. And I think I was having this discussion back in London, and someone made the point, I mean, certainly all the power of the internet and distributed information gathering and information distribution, again, I think is overall a very much more positive than negative, but it does create things like you will know if there's a serial killer in Singapore. Like you'll learn more about it, which is like far away and terrifying for the people of Singapore, but now it is terrifying for the people everywhere. Even though if you don't plan to go to Singapore, presumably you're not at risk. But fear, to your question, can spread really fast, and so can lies, famously. But fear is, I think, a really important thing. And if you get to terrorism, which is something we spend a lot of time, US, UK, trying to counter, they can continue to try to kill innocent people, and we work as hard as we can to prevent them from doing that. And we know their number one weapon, the real thing, I mean, they cannot defeat us in a traditional way. The only thing they could do is get us to defeat ourselves. And their real weapon is our fear. They can terrorize us, but we control whether we're terrorized. That is a choice each of us can make, to be freaked out or to be resilient. And I think that's really an important point. And I'm wary of getting on subjects that are sort of a downer, but I guess I invited this on. Ebola, I remind the 18-year-olds I talk to now, I say, how many of you wrote down Ebola? And no one writes down Ebola anymore. But I think we should not sort of gloss over it, because on the screens in this country, the ticker at the bottom of the newscast, we're saying on both sides of the Atlantic, a million people might die by Christmas. Right, that is scary. And I don't know how you felt. And it's like, oh dear. And do you remember some of the policy proposals coming out? To the woman's point in the back, I know, let's let no one from those West African countries ever board a plane ever again. I mean, people, grown-ups said that and meant that. And thankfully, leaders in the UK and in the United States and in France and professionals from the World Health Organization said, I know that is like a knee-jerk and terrible policy idea, because you will drive the disease underground, it'll make it 10 times worse. You have to do the opposite. It's not maybe your first instinct. You have to engage, you have to go there. And thousands of brave women and men from this country and from the UK, aided by our military, went there, teamed up with their brothers and sisters in those 3 countries that were affected to save people they never met, would never see again, and it worked. And those 3 countries were declared Ebola-free because we got hands-on and we engaged and we didn't fall into fear and the bad sort of wall-building policy proposals in that context. And that's a disease. And look, sadly, there'll be another Ebola, and hopefully we've gotten more resilient. We've learned from what worked and how to build capacity and get better the next time.
So out of respect for time, what we'll do is we'll take, because we also have a social media streaming and we have over 1,000 people watching live. So we'll take one question from the social media, and then we'll do 3 questions back to back, and then Mr. Ambassador Matthew, you can answer them in the way you'd like.
Ooh.
Is that okay?
Fun challenge. Yeah, I'm going to bring out my
beautiful.
pen.
Okay. Aubrey.
What would people be surprised to learn about what an ambassador is responsible for?
Are we going to do a bunch
Yes,
together?
let's
Okay,
do a bunch together. So let's have one in the back, 2 and 3. Okay, we'll do a fourth one because I felt you. Okay. It better be a good question. But please make it short and put it in a kind of a quick one sentence. And then we'll end after. We're going to have a reception. So for those of you who didn't have a time to ask a question, you can by all means come up and have a conversation with Mr. Ambassador. Okay, please.
First of all, thank you for being here today, Ambassador. My question goes to the title of today's talk, which is 21st Century Diplomacy. Do you think the answer for 21st century problems and issues is the answer for them is still diplomacy? And for young people who aspire to join diplomatic service, what was your answer? What's the best way to build bridges between countries and between people? Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time today. My name is Zaid Tahabsum. I'm from Jordan. And my question is, you talked a lot about listening. Do you think, or how effective do you think listening is at this point in terms of progress in the Syrian conflict? Thank you.
We'll take one here.
Mr. Ambassador, we are in a very diverse school. This room has representatives of over, I'm sure, tens of nations. I am a Russian citizen, for example. I have a lot of friends in Ukraine, and I study here. And the problem I face is that I really have 3 different sources of information. I can get news at any time, but it's always different news. And I'm sure you have your own sources that are confirmed, but do you see that problem of misinformed countries? Because that's the way it is. If you speak to people from different countries, they would say, oh, no, this is a fact, and this is a fact, and sometimes those don't match. How do you deal with that problem? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one last one, and then we'll have to go to, we'll have to wrap. Please.
Matthew, what are your thoughts on managing the public's mistrust and fear in the NSA and their British counterpart, GCHQ? Thank you.
It's all yours now.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, guys. No, I'm really glad that these are really hard and important issues, so I'm glad we're digging into them. It's hard to weave them into one coherent thing, so I'm going to go in reverse order and try to just quickly. On NSA surveillance, GCHQ, the bad guys are being clever. They're not all guys. Many of them are. The bad folks are being really clever about how to use technology to do horrific things. I am very glad that we've got great Americans in our intelligence community, including the NSA, who are trying to be more clever and stay on top of that to keep us safe. They've got a great partner in GCHQ, getting really clever people to try to stay ahead of the bad guys and that stuff. And President Obama, when he came in, and he actually announced this before the Snowden revelations, we need to evolve. Post 9/11, some of the things we put in place, remember, think 2001, and lots of you in the room were a lot younger, no iPhone, no YouTube. Google was around, but smaller then. So no Twitter, no Facebook. So if you'd ask someone in 2001, what % of their lives is, quote, online or digital? People would be like, oh, I do some online banking. And now the fact is, in 2016, your entire life has some digital component. Your social life, your medical life, your financial life, all of it. And so we as citizens of the United States, of the United Kingdom, and by the way, citizens all around the world, have legitimate, real privacy concerns about what is done with that data and who can look at it. And that's why President Obama changed a bunch of the way we do our surveillance. He didn't eliminate it because he thinks it's really important to keep us safe, and we got to change it. We got to achieve balance between respecting privacy concerns, not only in America but around the world, and trying to keep ourselves safe. And if you think about the power of words and images, if you think of the balance like this, I think, or like a pendulum, I think it's a very unhelpful way to think about it, because it's sort of like, well, if you get better security, then presumably you're getting less privacy. But I don't think it is that kind of balance. It's actually balanced like riding a bicycle. It's balanced by moving forward. And I think your generation is going to have to be really on top of these issues, because whatever balance we achieve now, I am very confident will not be the right balance 10 years from now. We've got to keep evolving as the technology evolves to keep that balance in place. News sources, propaganda, all that stuff, major issue. I mean, one of the things, they're tiny on the negative stuff I hear from 18-year-olds, but I mean, weird conspiracy theories, some are silly, some are not silly. I mean, occasionally I'll get someone who thinks that the US government sanctioned the 9/11 attack. I mean, that is just horrible. And these kids, were like 3 years old when that happened, but they read about it somewhere. And so it's an opportunity to sort of put that conspiracy theory to rest. But these things can travel fast and find an audience, sadly, as can the sort of hateful ideology coming out of ISIS, ISIL, and Al-Qaeda. And I think certainly, I mean, we probably have journalism students. I mean, more people doing more good journalism is a really good thing, because we need more of it. Syria, you asked about listening. I think it is probably, with the horrific situation there for many, many years, and what Jordan has done to, I mean, I was just with your ambassador to the United Kingdom, Mazen Hammoud, who's a great guy. We just showed us Salam Neighbor, this wonderful documentary that shows what the people of Jordan have done and the daily acts of hospitality that they have shown to these families in crisis in their country and in Lebanon and in Turkey. And this is a situation where one of the phrases I don't like to say as a diplomat, except it does apply to Syria, is we need actions, not words. And I don't like that phrase because it makes it sound like words don't matter and actions always do. And I said, well, look, words can help make an outcome better, or they can hurt. Actions can make an outcome better or be worse. So I don't know why we always cheapen words, especially in diplomacy, since so much of it is words, listening to words and saying words. In the case of Syria is the exception that proves the rule, I think, because certainly in the case of Russia, they have said all the right things. They have said two things. They have said there is no military solution to the civil war in Syria. There must be a political one. And two, ISIS and ISIL is a threat to everyone and needs to be dealt with militarily and all the other ways. So that's really important in getting them to that place to say that, as did Iran and Saudi Arabia, and a whole bunch of people sat around the table and agreed to those words, and that's really important. And yet the actions over the last few weeks and longer from Russia seems to be doing the opposite of those words that they said. And that's really distressing. And that's why Secretary Kerry announced a pause in the cooperation with Russia, because the words and the actions were so horrifically mismatched. Now my notes are failing me. A typical day of an ambassador, I have my daily schedule printed out on a little card that fits in here. It's like an Outlook thing, and I have it color-coded, so I think of it as a rainbow. I have blue for government to government, green for promoting trade and investment, yellow for press engagements, gray for internal meetings, and then purple for the youth outreach and cultural things. So any given week is a wonderful rainbow of those activities. And I think that's...
I think you covered them all.
I think I did. There's one here I can't really read. But let me, it says something, diplomacy and bridges. So maybe I'll close with a thought that I think gets at that question that I can't read what I wrote. I really want to thank you all, especially that last round of questions, or all the questions today and suggestions which deal with difficult issues. And I think we are at our best as a country when we are humble enough to be self-critical and we are confident enough to be self-correcting. And I don't think we get to do that unless we're really honest to talk about the difficult international or the difficult domestic things. And bridge building was the theme. I think each of us can leave here today and committed to listen to someone we don't agree with on whatever topic it is. I mean, political elections I can't talk about, but there's a ripe thing over the next few weeks to really listen to someone you don't agree with, really try to explore that other shore. How many people here like to lose an argument? Nobody, and they never do. No one ever raises a hand. And yet so much of our schooling in high school and in universities encourages us to be argument winners and be super clever. And I know that's important, and that works in the real world too. I just would put out a plea for the other thing, not winning arguments, but really doing the kind of listening and bridge building that President Obama not only preaches, but he practices. And I think it really can work for each of us. And I encourage you to do that, because when you look around the world, it can look really bleak, like how can you possibly change someone's heart? And there was a great quote from Dr. Martin Luther King 4 months before he was assassinated. He came to the UK. The University of Newcastle was the only place that would give him an honorary degree, and lots of other things like, oh, that's scandalous. How can you give this man an honorary degree? And they did. And he, of course, won a Nobel Prize before that. And in his remarks to the students at University of Newcastle, he said, look, it might be hard to change someone's heart to not want to lynch me, but if you make it illegal for them to do it, so if you change laws, you can change habits, and if you change habits, you can eventually change hearts. And I am inspired by that line. So if we can start changing our own habits in others, and we keep up that pattern, pretty soon over time, I think you really can change hearts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for this conversation. Please, everyone, join me in showing him a warm Northeastern welcome in this reception. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.